What if a homeless man risked everything to save a stranger, only to be pulled into a world where he didn't belong? A wealthy family, a buried past, a dangerous enemy lurking in the shadows. When Ethan steps in to stop a robbery, he doesn't expect gratitude, let alone an invitation into the life of the girl he saved. But her father sees him as a threat. His past refuses to stay buried. And the streets he left behind? They want him back. How far will he go to prove he deserves a second chance? And what happens when the past comes knocking with a price on his head? San Francisco had a way of swallowing people whole. The bright lights of the Bay Area, the towering skyscrapers, the electric hum of life, it all made the city seem alive. But beneath the surface, in the dark alleyways and damp sidewalks, there were those the city had left behind. Ethan knew this all too well. At 20 years old, he had spent the last 4 years learning to survive on these streets. Tenderloin was his home, if you could call it that. A maze of rundown motels, makeshift shelters, and abandoned storefronts where those like him clung to existence. The city had a way of making people disappear. And if you weren't careful, you'd fade into the background like a ghost. He pulled his hood tighter against the cold wind rolling in from the bay. Stepping over a pile of discarded newspapers. Another cold night. Another night of searching for a dry place to sleep. His stomach growled, but hunger had become background noise, a dull ache he was used to ignoring. Near a closed-up diner, a group of men huddled around a trash can fire. Ethan recognized one of them, Frank. Frank had been on the streets longer than anyone Ethan knew. 50, maybe older, with a thick beard and tired eyes. He had the look of a man who had seen too much and given up trying to forget. "You look like hell," Frank muttered, shifting to let Ethan share the heat. "Thanks," Ethan said, rubbing his hands together. Frank pulled a half-smoked cigarette from behind his ear and lit it. "Got any plans tonight?" Ethan gave a hollow chuckle. "Yeah, thought I'd book a suite at the Fairmont." Frank smirked. "Right, and I'm running for mayor." Silence settled between them, filled only by the distant honking of car horns. Then, Frank exhaled slowly. "You ever think about getting out of here?" Ethan looked at him, the question gnawing at something deep inside. "Out of where?" he asked, gesturing to the city. "This is it, Frank. There's nowhere else." Frank shook his head. "That's where you're wrong, kid. There's always somewhere else." Ethan didn't answer. He had stopped believing in second chances a long time ago. They sat in silence until the fire started to die. "I should find a place for the night," Ethan said, pushing himself up. Frank nodded, watching him go. Stay out of trouble. Trouble had a way of finding him. The wind was sharper now, cutting through the layers of his hoodie. He needed to find shelter before the night got colder. He turned onto Market Street, scanning for any doorways or awnings that hadn't already been claimed. That's when he saw her. A girl, maybe 19, walking alone. She was dressed in a sleek coat, the kind that didn't belong in this part of town. She clutched her bag close, glancing over her shoulder as if she already sensed something was off. Ethan followed her gaze. A man stood half a block behind her, hands in his pockets, moving just a little too casually. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Not my problem. He had learned a long time ago that getting involved meant getting hurt. But as the girl turned down a quieter street, the man followed, and something in Ethan's chest twisted, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A memory, buried deep, surfaced before he could push it back down. A time when he hadn't acted fast enough. A time when he had lost everything because of it. He exhaled sharply. Then, without another thought, he started walking. Not toward shelter, not toward safety, but toward the girl, toward whatever was about to happen next. Lily walked with a steady pace, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain that had passed earlier. She adjusted the strap of her purse, pulling it closer to her body. Something felt off. Ethan watched from a distance, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn-out hoodie. The man trailing behind her wasn't just another pedestrian. The way he moved, the way he kept just far enough to not draw attention, it was deliberate. Ethan had seen enough guys like him to know where this was going. Not your problem, he told himself. But his feet had other plans. Lily turned a corner into a quieter street near Soma, where the glow of the city faded into patches of flickering streetlights. The man quickened his pace. Ethan clenched his jaw. And then it happened. The guy lunged forward, grabbing Lily's arm with one hand while yanking her purse with the other. "Give it up, sweetheart," the man growled. Lily let out a small gasp. Stumbling back, she tried to pull away. But his grip tightened. "Let go of me, Ray." Ethan recognized him now. He'd seen him before. A guy who lived off mugging drunk tourists and anyone who looked like easy prey. Fresh out of jail, mean as hell, and always carrying a knife. Ethan knew this was bad. Ray pulled out a blade, flashing it just enough for Lily to see. "You don't want trouble, do you?" Lily froze. Ethan took a step forward before he could stop himself. "There you are, babe. I've been looking everywhere for you." Ray turned his head slightly, confusion flickering across his face. Lily hesitated, then caught on. She yanked her arm away and stumbled toward Ethan, clutching his sleeve. "Yeah, I was waiting for you." Ray's expression darkened. "I don't know what game you two are playing, but this ain't your business, pal." Ethan shrugged, keeping his tone light. "See, that's where you're wrong. It kind of is." Ray wasn't buying it. His grip on the knife tightened. Ethan had seconds to act. He grabbed Lily's wrist and yanked her behind him. In the same motion, he swung his fist, landing a solid punch against Ray's jaw. Ray staggered back, cursing. "Run," Ethan said. Lily didn't need to be told twice. They bolted down the street, Ethan leading the way. He knew these roads, the alleys, the back routes. Ray was fast, but Ethan had spent years learning how to disappear. Ray was right behind them, cursing loudly. Ethan spotted an old delivery truck parked beside a metal fence. "Over there," he shouted. Lily scrambled over the fence, Ethan right behind her. They landed on the other side just as Ray reached the gate, shaking it furiously. "You're dead, kid," Ray yelled. Ethan smirked. "Get in line." Ray spat on the ground before turning and disappearing back into the night. Lily pressed a hand to her chest, catching her breath. "That was stupid," Ethan finished. She let out a nervous laugh. "I was going to say insane." Ethan nodded. "That too." They stood there for a moment, the reality of what had just happened settling in. Lily exhaled slowly. "I don't even know how to thank you." "Don't worry about it. At least let me get you something to eat or..." "I'm good." She frowned. "Then let me call you a cab. Something." Ethan shook his head. "Not my thing." Lily studied him for a second. "You don't take handouts, do you?" Ethan smirked. "Not from rich girls in designer coats." She rolled her eyes. "Well, at least let me walk with you for a bit. Make sure you don't get jumped next." Ethan hesitated. He didn't need a babysitter, but he also wasn't in the mood to argue. "Fine." They started walking. A few minutes later, headlights bathed the sidewalk in white light as a sleek black car pulled up beside them. The door swung open. A tall man stepped out, his face sharp, his suit crisp. Lily's expression shifted. "Dad?" Ethan felt a prickle of unease. The man's eyes landed on him, his jaw tightening. "Lily," he said, his voice low. "Who is this?" Ethan didn't have to be a genius to know where this was going. The man standing in front of him, tall, clean-cut, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Ethan had made in his entire life, wasn't just another concerned parent. He was a man who liked control. And Ethan? He was a variable that didn't fit into whatever world this guy had built for his daughter. Richard's eyes stayed locked on him, sharp and assessing, like he was trying to figure out how much of a threat Ethan really was. Lily stepped forward before Ethan could say anything. "Dad, he helped me," she said, her voice firm. "Some guy tried to mug me." And Ethan stepped in. Richard's jaw tensed. He glanced at Lily, then back at Ethan. "Is that so?" Ethan shrugged. "That's what happened." Richard exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed. "And what exactly were you doing in that part of town?" Ethan knew the type. Men like Richard asked questions they already thought they had the answers to. "Existing," Ethan said flatly. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "Emily," Lily's mother, finally spoke up. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked, stepping closer to Lily, looking her over like she expected to find some hidden injury. "I'm fine, Mom," Lily assured her. Emily's gaze shifted to Ethan, and though she wasn't as openly hostile as her husband, There was still a wall there, curiosity mixed with caution. Lily straightened her shoulders. I want to do something for him. Richard's eyes snapped back to his daughter. Lily, we need to go home. She shook her head. Not yet. I want to at least buy him dinner. Richard's expression hardened. That's not necessary. It's the least I can do. Lily argued. Dad, please. Richard turned back to Ethan. What's your name? Ethan met his gaze. Unwavering. Ethan. Richard didn't offer a handshake. And how long have you been on the streets? Ethan? Ethan smirked, but there was no humor in it. You always ask strangers about their life stories. Or just the ones who look like me. Lily shot him a warning look. But Ethan didn't care. He'd been judged by men like Richard his entire life. Richard studied him for a long moment. Then turned to Emily. Thoughts? Emily sighed, rubbing her temple. Lily's right. The least we can do is offer him a meal. Richard's shoulders stiffened, but eventually, he nodded. Fine. One meal. He looked at Ethan. Then you move on. Ethan glanced at Lily, who was watching him expectantly. He wasn't sure why she cared so much. But for whatever reason, she did. A free meal wasn't something he got often. And maybe it would shut her up so she'd stop looking at him like he was some stray dog she just found. He shoved his hands into his pockets. All right, one meal. Lily smiled. The ride to their house was silent, save for the occasional notification chime from Lily's phone. Ethan sat in the back of the car, acutely aware of how out of place he looked in the spotless black leather seats. He stared out the window as the streets of San Francisco blurred by, slowly transitioning from the grittier parts of the city to well-maintained roads lined with houses that had gates and security cameras. By the time they pulled up in front of a massive home in Nob Hill, Ethan felt like he was stepping onto another planet. The house was modern, sleek, with floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed warmly from the inside. A perfectly manicured lawn stretched out in front, the kind Ethan had only seen in magazines people left behind at bus stops. He followed them inside, his boots leaving faint prints on the polished marble floor. The dining room was big enough to fit at least 20 people. Though tonight it was just the 4 of them. A housekeeper brought out plates, setting them down without a word. Ethan was used to eating quickly. But here, everything was precise, controlled. Richard sat at the head of the table, Lily and Emily on either side, leaving Ethan at the far end. It wasn't subtle. So, Ethan, Richard started, cutting into his steak with perfect precision. How does a young man like yourself end up homeless? Ethan didn't even glance up. Life happens. Richard raised an eyebrow. That's not much of an answer. Ethan finally met his gaze. It's the only one you're getting. Lily coughed into her napkin, hiding a smile. Emily looked uncomfortable. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying him. You seem awfully guarded for someone who just received an invitation into our home. Ethan put his fork down. And you seem awfully interested in my personal business for someone who doesn't want me here. Richard's jaw twitched. Emily cleared her throat, trying to ease the tension. So, Ethan, do you have any family in the city? Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. No. Lily frowned. None at all? Ethan's grip tightened around his knife. No. Silence stretched between them. Richard set his silverware down, steepling his fingers. I know men like you. Ethan's lips curled. That so? Richard nodded. Drifters. People who show up out of nowhere with a sob story, hoping to gain sympathy. Lily's face darkened. Dad. Richard held up a hand. I appreciate that you helped my daughter. I do. But let's not pretend we don't know how the world works. There are people who take advantage of kindness. People who see an opportunity and seize it. Ethan stared at him, heart pounding, but his face gave nothing away. Then Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded stack of cash. He placed it on the table between them. Take this, he said. Get yourself a hotel for the night, something warm to eat in the morning, and move on. The room went deathly silent. Lily looked horrified. Dad, are you serious? Ethan didn't move. He didn't look at the money. Didn't blink. He just sat there, feeling something old and ugly rise inside him. Then, finally, he reached forward, slow, deliberate, and picked up the cash. Lily sucked in a breath. Richard's expression remained unreadable. And then Ethan did something no one at that table expected. Ethan's fingers tightened around the stack of cash. the edges crisp against his skin. He could feel Richard's stare, heavy and expectant, like he was waiting for Ethan to make the obvious choice. Take the money, leave, prove his point. But something inside Ethan recoiled at the thought. Slowly, he placed the money back onto the table, his movements deliberate. The room was so quiet he could hear the faint hum of the chandelier above them. He pushed the stack toward Richard, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I don't need charity, Ethan said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. I didn't step in tonight because I wanted something in return. Richard's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker, something brief, something unreadable, before his jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this. Lily let out a breath, something close to a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Emily remained silent, her eyes flicking between her husband and Ethan, her thoughts unreadable. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying him. Then what do you want? Ethan shook his head. Nothing. Just to leave. Richard crossed his arms. You sure about that? Because from where I'm sitting, walking away from this, he gestured to the money, seems like a bad move. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. If you think that's the best thing you have to offer me, then you don't understand a damn thing about people like me. The air in the room thickened. Lily looked between them, frustration bubbling under her voice. Dad, stop. You don't have to treat him like some kind of scam artist. Richard barely glanced at her. I'm treating him like a realist. Ethan pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. Well, here's a reality check, he said. Not everyone's looking for a handout. Some of us just get by on our own. Richard didn't respond, just watched as Ethan stood up. Lily followed suit, her voice firm. If you're leaving, at least let me make sure you get somewhere safe. Ethan let out a short laugh. Safe doesn't exist where I come from. Lily frowned, stepping closer. Then let me drive you somewhere. Anywhere. Ethan shook his head. I don't need a ride. He turned toward the door, his pulse steady, his body already bracing for the cold outside. Lily hesitated before following him to the entrance. Where will you go? Ethan shrugged. There's always a place. She didn't look convinced. This city isn't kind at night. I know. Lily's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a second, she looked like she wanted to argue. But then she sighed, reaching into her coat pocket. At least take this, she said, handing him a folded piece of paper. Ethan unfolded it. A phone number. In case you change your mind, she said. Ethan glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket. Don't hold your breath. Lily smiled faintly. I'll try not to. Ethan stepped outside, the cold air biting against his skin. He didn't look back. The city stretched before him, wide and endless. By the time he reached Tenderloin, the streets had settled into a quiet hum. Dim streetlights flickered overhead, and the familiar scent of damp concrete and stale cigarettes filled the air. He made his way through the narrow alleys, past tents and cardboard shelters, until he spotted Frank sitting against the side of a liquor store. A cigarette dangled from his lips, the ember glowing faintly in the dark. Frank glanced up as Ethan approached. Well, look who's back. Ethan sat down on the curb beside him, stretching his legs out. You sound surprised. Frank snorted. Wouldn't be, if I didn't hear your name getting passed around earlier. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Frank took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the night. Word on the street is someone's been asking about you. Ethan's jaw tightened. Who? Frank shrugged. Didn't get a name. Just some guys poking around, trying to figure out where you've been. A cold sensation settled in Ethan's chest. He'd spent years staying off the radar, avoiding attention. If someone was looking for him, it wasn't for anything good. Frank flicked the cigarette onto the pavement, crushing it under his boot. So, kid, what did you do to get noticed? Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Richard sat in his study, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows against the walls. His fingers drummed lightly on the polished wood as he stared at the laptop screen in front of him. Ethan. The name had stuck in his mind like a splinter, an irritation he couldn't ignore. Something about the kid felt off. Not just the way he carried himself, that quiet defiance. The way he refused the money, but the way Lily had looked at him. That concerned softness in her eyes. Like she had already decided he was worth saving. Richard wasn't a man who trusted easily. He built his life on careful calculations, on understanding risks before they could become liabilities. And right now, Ethan was a risk. He clicked on the message his private investigator had sent just hours earlier. Attached was a file, a collection of documents detailing Ethan's past. Richard's eyes skimmed over the first few pages. Born in Oakland, no current address, no listed relatives. Then his gaze landed on something that made him sit up straighter. A police report, 4 years old. He clicked on it, reading each line carefully. Ethan had been questioned as a witness in a robbery, a jewelry store in downtown San Francisco. A man had been killed. The suspect? A Daniel Foster. Richard's stomach tightened. Ethan's last name wasn't Foster, but the report mentioned that he had been seen with Daniel multiple times before the crime took place. And then there was the kicker. Daniel had disappeared, and Ethan? He had slipped through the cracks. No charges, no conviction, just vanished. Richard exhaled slowly, shutting the laptop. This wasn't just some kid who had fallen on hard times. This was someone with a history of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now, that same someone was dangerously close to his daughter. Ethan curled up against the cold brick wall of the alley, his jacket doing little to keep the chill out. The city hummed around him, car engines, distant laughter, the occasional siren cutting through the night. He shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position on the flattened cardboard beneath him. Sleep never came easy, not out here. His eyes had just started to drift shut when a voice cut through the quiet. "Look what we got here." Ethan tensed. He barely had time to sit up before a boot slammed into his ribs, knocking the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded through his side as he rolled over, coughing. He tried to push himself up, but a hand grabbed the collar of his jacket, yanking him upright. And then he saw him. Ray. A slow, mocking grin spread across the man's face. "You really thought you could mess with me and walk away?" Ethan clenched his teeth, his muscles coiling, ready to fight. But then he saw the 2 other men standing behind Ray, their faces sharp with amusement. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. Ray's grin widened. "Let's see how tough you are when no one's around to save you." The first punch landed hard against Ethan's jaw. His head snapped to the side, the taste of blood flooding his mouth. He barely had time to recover before another fist slammed into his stomach. He stumbled back, but the alley was too narrow, the wall behind him leaving nowhere to escape. A knee to his ribs, a fist against his temple. He hit the ground hard, the world spinning. Ray crouched beside him, gripping his hair and yanking his head up. "Next time," Ray murmured, "you mind your own damn business." Then, just as he raised his fist for the final blow, a sudden burst of light flooded the alleyway. Tires screeched against the pavement. Ray cursed, shielding his eyes. Ethan blinked through the haze of pain, barely registering the sound of a car door slamming shut. And then, "Get the hell away from him." Lily's voice. Ethan's stomach twisted. Ray's expression darkened. He stood up slowly, turning toward the car's headlights. "You gotta be kidding me," he muttered. Lily was standing beside the open driver's side door, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't look afraid, she looked furious. Ray took a step toward her. "You really want to get involved in this, sweetheart?" Lily didn't flinch. "You lay another hand on him, and I swear." She turned the car's high beams up to full. Ray cursed again, stumbling back, momentarily blinded. It was enough of a distraction. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing himself up despite the burning pain in his ribs. He swung with everything he had, landing a punch square across Ray's face. Ray stumbled back, caught off guard. "Son of a..." But before he could recover, the sound of distant sirens filled the air. Ray's head snapped toward the street. "Let's go," one of his guys muttered. Already backing away, Ray glared at Ethan for a long moment. Then at Lily. "This ain't over," he spat, wiping blood from his lip. Then, like a shadow slipping back into the night, he was gone. Lily rushed forward. Ethan swayed on his feet, barely able to stay upright. Lily grabbed his arm, steadying him. "We need to get you to a hospital," she said, her voice tight with concern. Ethan shook his head. No hospitals. You're bleeding," she argued. Ethan exhaled shakily. pain radiating from every part of his body. No money, he murmured. Lily's grip on him tightened. I don't care. Get in the car. Ethan didn't have the strength to argue. As she helped him toward the car, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. Richard was going to lose his mind. The drive back to Nob Hill was quiet. Save for the rhythmic hum of the tires against the road, Ethan leaned against the car window, his breath fogging up the glass as the streetlights flickered past. His ribs ached with every movement. His head throbbed. But the worst of it wasn't the pain, it was the weight of what came next. He should have said no. But Lily wasn't giving him a choice. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale. Every few seconds, she glanced at him, her expression shifting between worry and determination. You don't have to do this, Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse. Lily didn't take her eyes off the road. You couldn't even stand up straight 5 minutes ago. What was your plan? Sleep in an alley while bleeding to death? Ethan exhaled sharply. I've had worse. That's not the point. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. A few minutes later, she pulled up in front of her house, the sleek gates opening silently as the car rolled into the long driveway. Ethan had barely unbuckled his seatbelt before the front door swung open. Richard stood in the doorway. His expression was unreadable at first, then his gaze dropped to Ethan. Slumped against the passenger seat, bruised and bloodied, and just like that, his face hardened. Lily barely had time to step out before Richard's voice sliced through the air. You brought him here? Ethan pushed the door open slowly, forcing himself upright even as pain flared through his side. Lily's shoulders squared. He was jumped. Dad, what was I supposed to do? Leave him in the street? Richard's nostrils flared. Yes. Ethan huffed a quiet laugh, wiping the blood from his lip. Don't hold back on my account. Richard ignored him, his gaze fixed on Lily. You do realize what kind of position this puts us in, right? You brought home a complete stranger. Lily took a step forward. Not a stranger. The guy who saved me from being mugged. Richard exhaled through his nose, his patience thinning. You should have called the police. Yeah? And let them arrest him for existing in the wrong part of town? Richard's jaw tensed. That's not how it works. Lily scoffed. You and I both know that's exactly how it works. Ethan watched the exchange, feeling like an intruder in his own argument. He could barely keep his balance. Yet here Lily was, standing her ground like he was worth fighting for. It didn't make sense. It made him uncomfortable. Richard turned to him, his expression sharp. What do you want? Ethan met his stare. Nothing. Then why are you still here? Ethan opened his mouth to answer. But Lily cut in first. Because I brought him here, she said. Because I couldn't just leave him there. Richard's gaze flicked between them, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply and turned toward the house. One night, Lily's lips parted, as if she wanted to argue. But Richard was already walking inside. Emily stood just beyond the doorway, watching the exchange with a mixture of hesitation and curiosity. She caught Ethan's gaze and gave him a small nod before stepping aside. Lily let out a breath and turned to Ethan. Come on. He hesitated. Everything in him screamed that this was a mistake. That he shouldn't step foot in a house like this. Shouldn't get too comfortable in a world that wasn't his. But his ribs ached. His head swam. So, against his better judgment, he followed her inside. The guest room was too big. That was Ethan's first thought as he lowered himself onto the bed. Wincing. The mattress was soft, too soft. The sheets smelled clean. The air too still. He was used to noise. To the constant hum of the city. Here, everything was quiet. Lily stood in the doorway, arms crossed. You okay? Ethan huffed a tired laugh. Not exactly my usual setup. But I'll manage. She hesitated, then took a step forward. Look, I know my dad's a lot. He thinks he's protecting me. Ethan glanced at her. From what? Me? Lily sighed. From anything he can't control. That, at least. Ethan understood. A beat of silence stretched between them before she shifted on her feet. I'll get you some ice. She left before he could respond. As soon as the door shut, Ethan let his head fall back against the pillows. He should be grateful. He should be relieved. Instead, all he could think about was Richard. And the way he had looked at him like he already knew exactly who he was. Richard sat in his office, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating his face. He reached for the file on his desk, flipping through the pages again. Ethan Carter. The boy had no record, at least. Nothing official, but the robbery report from 4 years ago told him enough. The mention of Daniel Foster wasn't something he could ignore. Richard tapped his fingers against the desk. Ethan had secrets. And as far as Richard was concerned, no matter what Lily thought, the boy wasn't staying long enough to let them surface. Ethan sat on the edge of the leather sofa, staring at the flickering flames in the massive fireplace across the room. The heat did little to chase away the chill in his bones. He had slept on worse, cold pavement, damp cardboard, the hard plastic seats of a late-night bus, but something about this house made his skin itch. The stillness, the spotless surfaces, the way everything was too perfectly placed, too untouched, as if no one really lived here. A blanket had been draped over him at some point during the night. He wasn't sure if it was Emily or Lily. Definitely not Richard. He pulled it off, stretching his sore limbs. His ribs still throbbed from the beating, but at least he could move without feeling like his lungs might collapse. The scent of coffee drifted in from the kitchen. Somewhere upstairs, footsteps moved softly across the hardwood floors. A normal morning in a house that wasn't his. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He needed to leave. Lily appeared in the doorway, holding a steaming mug. "You're awake." Ethan smirked. "You sound surprised." She walked over and held the cup out to him. "Figured you'd sleep in." "Considering," she gestured vaguely at his bruised face. Ethan hesitated before taking the coffee. "Thanks." Lily sat down in the chair across from him, watching him closely. "How are you feeling?" "Like I lost a fight." He took a sip. The warmth spread through his chest, steadying him. Lily leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I know my dad's being a jerk about this, but I meant what I said last night. I'm not just going to throw you back out there." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You should." Lily frowned. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Act like you don't deserve help." Ethan let out a short laugh. But there was no humor in it. Because people don't help without expecting something in return. Lily studied him for a moment. "That's a shitty way to live." Ethan took another sip of coffee, letting the heat settle his nerves. "Yeah, well, it's worked so far." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Before either of them could say anything else, Richard's voice cut through the room. "Lily, I need to speak with him." "Alone." Lily turned, glaring at her father. "Dad, now." Ethan set the coffee down, exhaling slowly. He didn't need to look at Richard to know where this was going. Lily hesitated, her expression full of concern. Ethan gave her a slight nod. She sighed and stood up. "Fine." She shot her father a warning glance before leaving the room. Richard waited until she was gone before stepping forward. He studied Ethan for a long moment, then nodded toward his office. Ethan didn't move right away. He considered walking out of the house completely, but something in Richard's eyes told him he wouldn't let that happen. So he stood, ignoring the stiffness in his ribs, and followed. The office was exactly what Ethan expected: sleek, organized, designed for someone who thrived on control. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with expensive-looking hardcovers. A glass desk sat in the center, perfectly arranged. Richard moved behind the desk and pulled open a drawer. He took out a manila folder and tossed it onto the surface. "Sit." Ethan didn't. Richard opened the folder, flipping through the pages. Ethan Carter. No legal address. No recorded employment. No contact with any living family. He glanced up. "Sound about right?" Ethan kept his face unreadable. "You always do background checks on people who save your daughter?" Richard didn't answer. He turned another page. 4 years ago, there was a robbery at a jewelry store downtown. You were there." Ethan's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. "I was a witness." Richard leaned back in his chair. "That's an interesting way of putting it." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had spent years burying that part of his life, convincing himself it didn't matter anymore. But now, sitting in front of a man who had the power to drag it all back into the light, he felt the old weight settle on his shoulders again. Richard folded his hands. "Daniel Foster. Ring a bell?" Ethan's grip tightened on the back of the chair in front of him. "No." Richard smirked. "Lying isn't going to help you, son." Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. What do you want me to say? Richard picked up a document. Reading aloud. Ethan Carter. Seen multiple times with Daniel Foster prior to the robbery. No charges filed due to lack of evidence. Daniel Foster. Still at large. He set the paper down. That's a hell of a coincidence. Ethan stared at him, his mind racing. He had known Richard was going to dig into his past, but he hadn't expected him to know this much. Richard leaned forward. I don't know what your connection to him is. And frankly, I don't care. But what I do care about is keeping my daughter safe. And as far as I'm concerned, you're a liability. Ethan felt something sharp twist in his chest, but he didn't let it show. Then kick me out. Richard's expression didn't change. I intend to. Ethan gave a slow nod, stepping back toward the door. Fine. Before he could leave, Richard's voice stopped him. But before you go, let me give you some advice. He said, if you care about Lily at all, even a little, you'll stay away from her. Ethan turned, his expression unreadable. Why? Afraid I'll ruin her perfect little world? Richard shook his head. No, I'm afraid that whatever trouble follows you is going to get her caught in the crossfire. Ethan didn't respond, because the worst part was, Richard wasn't wrong. Ethan sat stiffly in the chair across from Richard, his fingers curling into the fabric of his jeans as he stared at the folder on the desk. His name was printed on the label in bold block letters, a record of his past, a past he had spent years trying to outrun. Richard slid the folder toward him. Go ahead, open it. Ethan's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to reach forward. The paper inside felt heavier than it should. As soon as his eyes landed on the first page, he felt his pulse quicken. A police report. The date hit him first, 4 years ago. Then the details. A robbery, a jewelry store, a man dead. Ethan inhaled sharply, the words blurring together as memories clawed their way to the surface. Daniel. His throat went dry. Richard leaned forward, his voice low. You were there. Ethan swallowed hard. I was a witness. Richard's eyes were cold, unwavering. That's not what the report says. Ethan clenched his fists, his knuckles white. I wasn't involved. Richard flipped to another page. A grainy security camera still. Ethan, standing outside the store. His face wasn't clear, but it was him. You expect me to believe this was just a coincidence? Richard asked. Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. You don't have to believe anything. Richard studied him for a long moment. Then, in a quieter voice, he asked, Who's Daniel Foster? Ethan froze. For a second, the world around him faded. The office, the tension, Richard's piercing gaze, none of it mattered. All he could see was the past. Daniel's smirk, the way he always seemed untouchable. Like nothing could catch up to him. Like he could do whatever he wanted and walk away without a scratch. Until the night everything changed. Ethan forced his voice to stay even. He was my brother, not by blood, but close enough. Richard nodded, flipping through more pages. And he disappeared after the robbery. Ethan's teeth clenched. Yeah, convenient. Ethan's patience snapped. You think I wanted that? His voice was sharper than he intended. You think I wanted to get left behind? Questioned like some criminal? That guy was my family. And he ran. He left me there to take the fall. Richard didn't react. He simply closed the folder and steepled his fingers. Why should I believe you? Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. You shouldn't. Richard exhaled through his nose. So what am I supposed to do with this? Ethan? Ethan leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms. Not my problem. Richard studied him for a long moment. Then he stood, walking to the window, hands behind his back. I know you haven't told Lily. Ethan's chest tightened. Richard turned back around. How do you think she'll feel when she finds out? Ethan looked away. Because the truth was, he already knew the answer to that. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dim light filtering through the curtains. The weight of Richard's words still pressed against his chest. No matter what he did, no matter how far he tried to run, the past always found a way to drag him back. The name had haunted him for years. And now, thanks to Richard, it was back, clawing at the walls Ethan had spent so long building around himself. He glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. He had to go. Ethan grabbed a pen from the desk and tore a page from a notebook he had found earlier. His hand hesitated for a moment before he scribbled the words. "Thank you for everything, but I don't belong here." He folded the note and placed it neatly on the pillow. Then, without a sound, he slipped out of the room. The house was silent. He moved carefully through the hall, past the grand staircase, the expensive paintings, the world that wasn't his. By the time he reached the front door, his chest felt tight, but he ignored it. He stepped out into the cold night and didn't look back. Lily rubbed her eyes as she shuffled out of her room the next morning. Her hair still messy from sleep, she stretched, yawning as she made her way downstairs. Something felt off. The house was too quiet. Then she saw it. A single piece of paper, sitting on the pillow where Ethan had slept. Her stomach dropped. She snatched the note, her eyes scanning the words, reading them over and over as if they might change. No. Lily stormed through the house, searching for any sign of him. She checked the kitchen, the guest room, even the backyard. Nothing. He was gone. Anger bubbled in her chest as she marched into the dining room, where Richard sat sipping his coffee, perfectly composed. "You knew," she accused, slamming the note onto the table in front of him. Richard barely glanced at it. "I suspected." Lily's hands curled into fists. "What did you say to him?" Richard calmly set his cup down. "I told him the truth." Her heart pounded. "And what truth is that?" "That no matter how much you think you can help him, people like him don't change." Lily's breath hitched. "You don't know him." Richard met her gaze, unfazed. "And you do?" She clenched her jaw, shaking her head. "I'm going to find him." Richard exhaled through his nose. "Lily, don't be ridiculous." "No," she snapped. "What's ridiculous is that you think you can control everything. That you think people like Ethan don't deserve a second chance." Richard's expression didn't shift, but Lily didn't wait for his response. She turned on her heel and stormed out. She was going to find him. The streets of Tenderloin felt different now. Ethan had been gone less than 2 days, and yet it already felt like he had made a mistake coming back. The cold settled deep into his bones as he walked through the alleyways, past the same faces, the same broken souls. Frank was right. Once you stepped into their world, there was no going back. He found Frank sitting on an overturned crate, a cigarette dangling between his fingers. The older man exhaled a plume of smoke and shook his head. "Well, if it ain't the prodigal son," Frank muttered. "Thought you were gone for good." Ethan sat down beside him, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Didn't work out." Frank chuckled dryly. "Didn't think it would." Frank studied him for a moment. "You look like hell." Ethan huffed a laugh. "Feels about right." Frank took another drag before sighing. "Word of advice, kid, you don't just walk into their world and then back into ours. People notice." Frank hesitated before lowering his voice. "Couple of guys been asking about you. Word is, someone saw you get into a fancy car the other night. Now they're wondering why a street rat like you has connections with rich folks." Ethan's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the alley. "Well, look who it is." Ethan's stomach twisted as he turned. The bastard was grinning, his hands tucked into his pockets. But the look in his eyes was anything but friendly. 2 other guys flanked him, both of them bigger, meaner looking. Ray clicked his tongue. "You've been busy, huh? Heard you made some new friends up in Nob Hill." Ethan forced himself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ray smirked. "Come on, man, no need to play dumb. We both know you're worth more now than you were a week ago." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm not worth anything." Ray chuckled, stepping closer. "See, that's where you're wrong." The first punch came out of nowhere. Ethan barely had time to react before one of Ray's guys grabbed him from behind. Locking his arms, Ray's fist connected with his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. He gasped, struggling against the hold, but the grip was too strong. Ray leaned in, his voice low. "Here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna help us out. You're gonna call that pretty little rich girl, and she's gonna bring us some money." Ethan glared up at him, his breathing ragged. "Go to hell." Ray grinned. Wrong answer. The last thing Ethan saw was Ray's fist swinging toward his face. Then everything went black. Ethan's head throbbed as he came to, the dull ache in his skull pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The air was thick with the scent of oil and saltwater, the unmistakable stench of the docks. His wrists burned where the zip ties bit into his skin. His hands pinned behind the metal chair he was tied to. He blinked, his vision swimming back into focus. A single overhead light flickered above, casting jagged shadows across the rusted walls of the warehouse. Footsteps. Ethan's head snapped toward the sound just as Ray sauntered into view. A smirk stretched across his bruised face. Well, Ray mused, crouching in front of him. Didn't think I'd run into you again so soon. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. Missed me that much? Ray chuckled, shaking his head. Not exactly. See, I was real pissed at you for messing up my night. But then I thought, why waste a good opportunity? He pulled a phone from his pocket, waving it lazily in the air. Got a little call to make. Ray dialed a number, then pressed the phone to his ear. After a few rings, he grinned. Hey there, sweetheart, he drawled. I believe you know a guy named Ethan. Lily nearly dropped her phone. She had been pacing her bedroom, her mind spinning with thoughts of where Ethan could have gone. The moment she saw the unknown number, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Now, as Ray's voice slithered through the speaker, her grip on the phone tightened. What did you do to him? Relax, Ray said, amusement lacing his tone. He's still breathing. For now. Lily's heart pounded. What do you want? There was a pause before Ray chuckled. Smart girl. I'll make this simple. You bring me $100 grand, and I let your little hero walk out of here. No cops, no tricks, just cash for his life. Lily's throat felt tight. You have 24 hours. Ray continued, or I start sending you pieces of him. The line went dead. Lily stared at her phone, her pulse hammering. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to think. Ethan was in danger. She had to act fast. Richard was standing in his office, scrolling through his emails when Lily stormed in. He barely had time to look up before she slammed her hands onto his desk. I need your help, she said, breathless. Richard arched an eyebrow. I assume this has to do with your missing stray? Lily ignored the jab. He's been taken. Richard stilled. Lily's voice wavered. They're demanding a ransom. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And what exactly do you expect me to do? Lily's eyes burned. I need the money. Richard scoffed. You're joking. Do I look like I'm joking? Richard set his phone down, his jaw tightening. You cannot be serious. Lily, you're asking me to hand over $100,000 to criminals. For what? A man you barely know? Lily's fists clenched. I know enough. Richard's face darkened. This is absurd. I won't risk our family's safety for someone who doesn't belong in our world. Lily's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like glass. He saved my life. Richard's mouth pressed into a thin line. Emily appeared in the doorway, watching the exchange carefully. Lily turned to her, desperation creeping into her voice. Mom, you understand, right? We can't just leave him. Emily hesitated, her gaze flickering to Richard. Lily's breath hitched. Mom? Richard exhaled slowly. The answer is no. Something inside Lily snapped. She straightened, her shoulders squared. Then I'll do it myself. Richard's gaze hardened. Lily. But she was already turning, grabbing her bag and marching toward the door. Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. Lily. She didn't look back. Ethan worked at the zip ties around his wrists, ignoring the sting as the plastic dug into his skin. Ray sat a few feet away, watching him like a cat with a trapped mouse. His two goons loomed nearby, arms crossed. You're awfully quiet, Ray mused. Not gonna beg? Ethan scoffed. Not my style. Ray grinned. I respect that. Then he stood, cracking his knuckles. But you see, I need that girl to take me seriously. Ethan tensed as Ray stepped closer, his fingers curling into fists. Hurting me won't get you what you want, Ethan said. Ray smirked. No, but it'll be fun. Then he swung. Ethan barely had time to brace before pain exploded across his cheek. His head snapping to the side, his vision blurred, stars dancing at the edge of his sight. He gritted his teeth, swallowing down the groan rising in his throat. Ray chuckled. Still wanna be a tough guy? Ethan flexed his fingers. Then he saw it. One of Ray's guys had stepped closer, standing just within reach. His stance was loose, distracted. Ethan made his move. With all the strength he had left, he wrenched his body forward, slamming his forehead into the guy's nose. The man howled in pain. Stumbling backward, Ethan used the moment of chaos to yank against his restraints, the zip tie snapping against the sharp edge of the chair's metal frame. He was free. Ray cursed, lunging at him, but Ethan was already moving. He ducked low, driving his elbow into Ray's ribs before shoving past him. He sprinted toward the warehouse exit, his breath ragged, but before he could reach the door, a hard impact slammed into his side. He crashed to the ground, pain flaring through his ribs as Ray tackled him down. Ray grabbed him by the collar, his face twisted in fury. "Bad move," he hissed. Then the fist came down again. Ethan's world faded to black. Lily gripped the duffel bag tighter as she stepped out of the car. The salty air from the bay was thick, mixing with the distant hum of cargo ships and the faint screech of seagulls. A cold wind cut through the empty streets. But it wasn't the cold that made her stomach twist, it was the silence. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal doors barely holding onto their hinges. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, but she forced herself forward. She had no choice. As she approached, the door creaked open, revealing Ray standing in the dimly lit space beyond. He leaned against a stack of crates, arms crossed, a smug grin stretching across his face. "Look at that," Ray said, amusement dripping from his voice. The princess actually showed up. Lily kept her expression cold. "Where is he?" Ray chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you're in a position to make demands?" He nodded toward the bag in her hands. "Let's see it." Lily unzipped the duffel just enough for him to glimpse the stacks of cash inside. "Now show me Ethan." Ray's smirk widened. "See, that's the thing. We had a little change of plans." Lily's heart slammed against her ribs. "What do you mean?" Ray stepped closer, his eyes glinting with something dark. "Money's nice and all, but it ain't enough. That guy of yours? He messed with the wrong people. We're making an example out of him." Lily's grip on the bag tightened. "Where is he?" Ray tilted his head, feigning thought. "Oh, he's around. Or at least, he was." Lily's blood ran cold. Before she could react, the warehouse doors slammed shut behind her. Richard watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He stood in the shadows near the docks, his men positioned strategically around the perimeter. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with criminals. But tonight was different. Tonight, it was about his daughter. And whether he liked it or not, it was also about Ethan. Richard had spent his life believing in control, in order. People were either assets or liabilities. And he had been convinced Ethan was the latter. But as he watched Lily, defiant and fearless, stepping into danger for someone she barely knew, something shifted. This wasn't about whether Ethan deserved saving. This was about Lily. Richard exhaled sharply. "Move in," he ordered. Ethan barely felt the cold concrete beneath him anymore. His body was bruised, his vision hazy, but he forced himself to stay awake. Ray's guys had worked him over good. His ribs burned with every breath. His arms ached from being tied back for so long. But he couldn't afford to black out now. Not when he heard Lily's voice. She was here. No, 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 no. His pulse kicked up in panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be safe. Far away from this. He struggled against his restraints, his wrists raw from the effort. Then he heard Ray's voice. Casual and cruel. "Looks like your girl's got more guts than you." Ethan lifted his head, forcing his vision to focus. Through the open door of the back room, he saw Lily, standing firm, eyes blazing. Ray turned toward her, his posture relaxed, but Ethan could see the way his fingers twitched. He was enjoying this. Ethan's muscles coiled, his mind scrambling for a way out. Then, a sound, a single, sharp click. Ray froze. The sound came again, this time closer. Ethan recognized it instantly. A safety being disengaged. Then, from the shadows, Richard stepped forward, and in his hand was a gun. Ray's smirk faltered for the first time. "Now, this is unexpected," he muttered, glancing at the men behind him. Richard's expression didn't waver. "Let her go." Ray exhaled slowly, looking from Richard to Lily. Then back again. "Didn't think you had it in you, old man." Richard cocked his head slightly. "Try me." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, In a blur of motion, Ray lunged for his gun. A shot rang out. Chaos erupted. Richard's men stormed the warehouse. Gunfire cracking through the air. Ray dove behind a stack of crates, barking orders at his men. Ethan saw his chance. With a burst of adrenaline, he yanked against his restraints, the rope slipping just enough for him to free one hand. He twisted, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs, and grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor. Ray's men were too busy with the ambush to notice him. Lily dropped behind cover as Richard's men fired back. She locked eyes with Ethan through the chaos, her breath catching when she saw him move. Ethan launched forward, driving the pipe into the back of Ray's knees. The man crashed down with a curse, his gun skidding across the floor. Ethan didn't hesitate. With everything he had left, he swung again, knocking Ray to the ground. Ray groaned, trying to push himself up, but Ethan was already on top of him. His knuckles cracked against Ray's face. Again and again, years of frustration and anger pouring into every hit. Enough. Richard's voice cut through the haze. Ethan's breathing was ragged, his fists trembling. Ray groaned beneath him, barely conscious. Ethan forced himself to pull back, his vision blurred as he swayed, exhaustion finally hitting him like a freight train. Lily was suddenly there, her hands on his face, her eyes wide with concern. "You're okay," she whispered, searching his gaze. "You're okay." Ethan's legs gave out. She caught him before he hit the ground. The warehouse fell silent as Richard's men secured the scene. Ray and his crew were restrained. The fight over, Richard exhaled, lowering his gun. Then he turned to Ethan, who was still leaning against Lily, barely conscious. For the first time, Richard really looked at him. Not as a criminal, not as a problem, but as the man who had just risked everything to fight back. To survive, to protect his daughter. Richard sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Let's get him out of here." Ethan woke to the sound of distant waves crashing against the shore. His body ached, the pain dull but ever present, a reminder of everything that had happened. The soft weight of the blanket draped over him felt foreign, too clean, too warm. This wasn't the warehouse. This wasn't the street. This was Richard's house. He blinked against the morning light filtering through the window, trying to sit up, but his ribs protested. A quiet groan escaped before a voice interrupted. "You should probably stay still." Lily. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of amusement and concern. Ethan exhaled. "Not my style." Lily smirked before stepping inside, carrying a tray. "Yeah, I figured." She set it down on the nightstand. "Breakfast. Not sure what you eat, so I just grabbed toast and coffee." Ethan eyed it. "You didn't have to." Lily sat on the edge of the bed, tilting her head. "Yeah, well, I wanted to." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken things. Lily broke it first. "My dad wants to talk to you." Ethan let out a short laugh. "Great. Pretty sure he's still deciding whether to throw me out or press charges." Lily rolled her eyes. "He's not that bad." Ethan gave her a look. She sighed. "Okay, maybe he was that bad. But last night changed things." Ethan wasn't convinced, but he didn't argue. He took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest before pushing the blanket off and forcing himself upright. Might as well get it over with. Lily hesitated, then stood. "I'll be right outside." Ethan wasn't sure why that made him feel better. Richard stood by the fireplace in his study, staring into the flames as if they held the answers to something. When Ethan stepped inside, the older man turned, his expression unreadable. "You look terrible," Richard remarked. Ethan smirked. "You should see the other guy." Richard exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I should hate you, you know." Ethan's smirk faded. Richard met his gaze. "You turned my daughter's life upside down. You dragged her into a world she had no business being in." Ethan held his ground. "She made her own choices." Richard studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, she did." He walked to his desk, picking up a folder. "I looked deeper into your past." Ethan's stomach clenched. "Figured." Richard placed the folder down but didn't open it. "You're not a lost cause." Ethan blinked. He had been prepared for another fight. Another cold dismissal. "Not this." Richard crossed his arms. "I don't trust easily, but you've proven that you're willing to fight, for yourself. For Lily, that's something. Ethan wasn't sure what to say, so he said nothing. Richard sighed. I'm offering you a choice. You can leave. Richard continued. Go back to whatever life you had before. No one will stop you. Ethan waited. Or, Richard said, his voice firm, you can stay. You can make something of yourself. But if you do, you work for it. Ethan's heart pounded. Richard leaned forward slightly. No handouts. No pity. If you want a life, earn it. Ethan let out a slow breath, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Hope. 1 month later. The city looked different from up here. From the rooftop balcony of the guesthouse Richard had let him stay in, Ethan could see the bay stretching out into the horizon, the lights of San Francisco flickering like stars. He had a job now. Nothing fancy, just an apprenticeship at a mechanic shop Richard had pulled some strings to get him into. He worked long hours, his hands stained with oil and grease. But it was honest work. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a place. Lily walked up beside him, holding 2 bottles of beer. She handed him one without a word. They stood in silence, watching the city. Ethan took a sip. You ever think about how weird life is? Lily raised an eyebrow. That's a broad question. Ethan smirked. A month ago, I was sleeping on the street. Now I have a job and a roof. Lily smiled. Crazy what happens when you let people in. Ethan rolled the bottle between his hands. Yeah. Lily nudged him. So, are you gonna stay? Ethan didn't answer right away. Then he looked at her, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something he had to run from. I think I might, he said. Lily grinned. Good. Ethan exhaled, turning back toward the city. A second chance. He wasn't going to waste it. Sometimes, the people we least expect have the strongest fight within them. Ethan had nothing, yet he proved that resilience, loyalty, and courage are worth more than wealth or status. We all face battles, some against our past, some against the world's expectations. But in the end, it's the choices we make, not where we come from, that define who we are. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you have taken the second chance, or walked away? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more powerful stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.